Okay, everybody, how lovely to see you all here. Good evening and welcome to the third Brisbane edition of the Walkley Media Talks here at The Edge. And I would like to say that it's fantastic to see everybody comfortable and sitting around tables, and you all look like you're here for a cabaret show. But not so, not tonight. First of all, I would like to thank and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the elders of the Jagar and Turrbal peoples. It is a great credit to the quality of Queensland journalism that we have panellists such as you're about to see tonight, and to you, the Brisbane community, who have shown such interest in and engagement with journalism. I'd like to thank all of those involved in the Citizen J program, The Edge and the State Library of Queensland for maintaining the high standards that Australians expect of the Walkley Foundation. You may have heard that the Walkley 2012 Walkley Awards presentation will be held in Parliament House this year in Canberra to help celebrate the centenary of Canberra in 2012, sponsored by the Centenary of Canberra, which is an initiative of the ACT government. The awards will adopt a Canberra theme to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Australia's capital city in a venue that acknowledges the vital role of journalism that it plays in our democracy. Also in Canberra is a special capital edition of the annual Walkley's Media Conference, 2 days of workshops and panel discussions along with leading Australian and international speakers on November 29th and 30th. You will be able to find all that information and much more in the edition of the Walkley magazine in front of you on your tables, and there's more out on the front desk. They also contain the finalists of this year's Walkley Awards, which are due to be announced, as I said, on November the 30th. We do appreciate your patronage, and we look forward to you enjoying many more Walkley Media Talks. But here for tonight, thank you and enjoy.
Good evening. As the panellists take to the stage, my name is Matthew Fallon. I'm the Executive Manager here at The Edge. I too would like to thank the traditional owners of the land, the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and pay respects to their ancestors past and present. I'd like to acknowledge Jeanette Wright, our CEO and State Librarian, who is in attendance tonight, and Dr Dale Spender, Deputy Chair of the Library Board of Queensland. For those of you that don't know, The Edge is part of the State Library of Queensland and is a creative space where young people aged 15 to 25 come and experiment across art, science, technology and enterprise. Running a program like Citizen J at The Edge highlights the important role that libraries play in the information industry. Libraries are about their users and their stories. They're also safe places to ask questions and discuss important issues like we are here tonight. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the partners who are supporting us in the Citizen J venture. Mr Tim Fairfax, who has generously supported the Citizen J program through the Queensland Library Foundation. Our event partners, the Walkley Foundation and the Media and Entertainment Arts Alliance. Radio stations 4ZZZ and 4EB, and our training partners, the Community Media Training Organisation and Afters Open. We currently have an opening for a newsroom coordinator role in the Citizen J program. Our foundation newsroom coordinator, John Corlett, has taken a job with NATO in Afghanistan. Incredible, best of luck to him. Applications close on Friday for anyone who's interested in that. The Citizen J Experiments program, which some of you may or may not be aware of, will be announced very soon. We've received a strong number of very exciting entries to that, and we'll be making an announcement to do with that very soon. Now, before I introduce our chairperson for this evening, just to let you know that you can send tweets to the panel or to the chair of the panel, who may or may not take them up, to ask the panellists via the hashtag Walkleys. So please feel free to tweet away. And I'd also like to invite you to join a refreshment with us after if you'd like to continue the discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce Terry O'Connor, who was the online production editor at the Courier Mail for 5 years until he resigned in 2010. He helped design and build the newspaper site, developed advanced editing systems and trained dozens of News Limited journalists in Brisbane and Sydney in online writing, editing and production. He's now freelance and writes part-time for the Thomas Reuters online newsletter, The Risk Report, and tutors at QUT in digital journalism. He has published 2 books, They are Hold the Front Page, Writing for Newspapers, and A Pictorial History of Queensland. Terry is the Queensland Secretary of the Media and Entertainment Arts Alliance. Please welcome me in thanking Terry.
Thank you. I'll stand up for this part, then I'll sit down and let the real stars of the evening get on with it. I just have to introduce the three speakers tonight. In no particular order, Simon Holt, who is the Brisbane Times managing editor. Simon is a career journalist with over 25 years' experience. He's been a correspondent in Southeast Asia, a newspaper and magazine editor, leader writer, journalist, and editor. In 2008, he relaunched 20 suburban websites in Sydney and won the Pampa Hegarty Prize, which took him to the US and Europe to look at digital trends in foreign newsrooms. More recently, as editor of CanberraTimes.com.au, he doubled traffic in 8 months. Colin of River City Labs is widely regarded as a leader in the Brisbane startup community. He's a regular speaker and contributor to the local startup scene, an organizer of the Silicon Beach Brisbane Meetup Group, and a mentor to a number of Brisbane-based startups. He holds positions as Innovation Evangelist at River City Labs, a startup co-op working space in Fortitude Valley, and Innovation Strategist at Brisbane Marketing, the economic development arm of Brisbane City Council. Sarah Werkmeister is co-editor of the FourThousand Brisbane edition. She also writes for arts institutions and magazines. She's co-director of Artist Run Initiative. The Wandering Room, host of the best show ever on 4ZZZ FM, and takes photos for online platforms. She's a fan of road trips, stovetop coffee, I can relate to that, and hanging out with her chooks, which I can't really relate to. I'll be taking questions from Twitter, as Matt mentioned, and I dare say if anybody here wants to stand up and ask a question, we can probably handle that. In the meantime, I'm going to start with Simon, asking him how the Brisbane Times newsroom is different, coming from a metro hybrid legacy and newspaper, how he finds Brisbane's newsroom. Simon.
Yeah, it's a good question because I've come from Canberra where we were looking at integrating a newsroom of about 80 people into a digital-first environment. I come to Brisbane and I have a newsroom full of journalists who are accustomed to writing for a digital environment. So what they're doing is they're preparing news specifically for a digital audience, which is quite unique in the current landscape. There are two major online-only environments, and that is WA Today in Perth and here in Brisbane. There's also Adelaide, but that's not ours. And so how is it different? It's not a lot different. It really isn't. The goals and the accomplishments are the same. What we're trying to do is we're trying to engage, we're trying to inform, we're trying to entertain people. We're trying to present a news culture which is based on integrity, based on credibility, and we're trying to be accurate in what we do. So, in essence, what we're achieving through our platform is not dissimilar to what we've been trying to achieve for 100 years. The only difference being that we can tell the story in a slightly different way. So we can incorporate storifying, we can incorporate tweets, we can incorporate video, we can incorporate every platform there is. And that's the beauty of the internet, is that we can incorporate all platforms into one.
Sarah, your side is somewhat different as Brisbane events, basically. Can you tell us a bit about that and how you have to handle the pressures of the internet?
I don't know if they're really pressures, but so 4,000/the Thousands Brisbane, as it's called now, we focus on subculture and cultural happenings in Brisbane and basically engaging with community and telling people about what's going on in their city and interacting with our audience through the internet, but then also having a very physical presence by hosting events and stuff like that. And that, I don't know.
Okay, Colin, you're a startup expert, and we're talking about online now, so you're the key person here. How do you make a buck on the internet?
If I had the answer to that, I'd probably be on my yacht right now. I think there's a couple of parts to the answer, and I think obviously content is an important part of the online presence and will continue to be. But increasingly, I think we're seeing companies popping up and growing very rapidly when they're not actually creating content, they're providing an interface to content. Might be user, in fact, often it is user-generated content. So, you know, examples that we're all familiar with are Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Instagram's a great one. It was acquired by Facebook not very long ago for $1 billion after having been in business for the grand total of 18 months and having generated exactly that much revenue. So, you know, these are businesses that even 5 years ago, you just couldn't set out to create and grow in that sort of period of time. But you're now seeing the potential for massive user adoption. So Instagram, if I remember right, had 50 million users at the point it was acquired by Facebook. That's 50 million users acquired in 18 months from a standing start. So to me, that's the sort of opportunity that exists, and we ought to be thinking about, not just as you know, technical entrepreneurs or software hackers, coders, whatever, but also within existing businesses to be thinking about, you know, how are we doing something that could be monetized or spun out where it could actually have a life of its own and generate that sort of user growth.
Okay, what about our first Twitter question has arrived, and it's to you again, Colin. How do you make a buck in the newsroom in this context?
In the newsroom, look, I'm by no means an expert. Look, I think Simon's comments were on the money in terms of having quality content, having some depth in that content, because you know, we're having a chat before about the fact that you know, everyone can be first, and you can be on the scene and through Twitter or Facebook, whatever, report things, but that doesn't necessarily mean you've got, you know, depth and quality and accuracy in the content. I think there's also now a need to have more diversity in the sorts of media that you use. A lot of people now, you know, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, the first, second and third screen in the home, right? And it used to be that the television was without exception the first screen, and then maybe you had an iPad and then your phone or whatever. Increasingly we're seeing that shifting so that the iPad or other tablet device is the first screen. And so that's the sort of opportunity that I think we can capitalize on, because the content you're looking at on that device isn't going to be the same as the content you're looking at on the television.
No, Simon, how do you handle that pressure when you have the phone, iPad, computer, TV?
I just want to expand a little bit further on that if I can, and,
sure.
And that is to say that we, in newspaper business, we've always been, I guess, in the business of embracing communities, whereas in the online industry, what we're in the business of is creating an environment for those communities. Now, there's a tangible difference there. And in terms of making a buck, we need to look at what the advertisers want, and we become the conduit for those advertisers to reach those communities. So if we're doing that in a feasible way, then we'll be making a buck. I don't think it's a secret that Brisbane Times is in the black, which we're very proud of within a 5-year plan. So that was an extraordinary gamble that Fairfax took 5 years ago, and we've proven that it is possible to create a viable news option in a digital environment. Sorry, I've forgotten your question.
Well, the conventional wisdom is that the rivers of gold died when Craigslist started the death rattle, and that the classified ads have died by comparison to what they used to be, and they are what paid for the big buildings, the presses, the trucks, the drivers, the journos.
There are still a few people down south singing their songs about the rivers of gold, but
fewer each day.
I think those days are long gone. It's now about smaller returns, but broader environment.
So obviously you can't talk about commercial and confidence items, but Brisbane Times is in the black. Can you tell us a bit more about how much and how you're managing that?
I can't tell you how much. I wish I could. But we're in the growth side of the business, and most news organisations the world over. I had the luxury of wandering through the Wall Street Journal for a few days a couple of years ago, and it's becoming a cutthroat business. It's always been a cutthroat business, but today the cutthroat is not about who you like, it's about how you present your news to an environment or to people when they want it. It's about giving people what they want, when they want it. And not to the point, of course, of presenting galleries full of bikini-clad women, if that's the case. We all know that's going to generate large amounts of traffic, but that's not why our business is. Our business is to inform. So, but at the Wall Street Journal, each of their editors of a particular environment, so if they were the editor of the travel section, if the travel section's traffic wasn't increasing, they were out the door. It was very much a cutthroat radio type environment where you need to perform. And performing is about engaging your audience. And now we can see what people are reading at any given time. We can see. And that just leads me a little bit, I guess, to making a buck, which is the theme for tonight. And that is that we can now show advertisers what people are reading at any given time. They can then target their niche audience. The advertising scale becomes a lot leaner when you're looking for a real return.
You have a question here at the front.
Thank you, Tony Reeves. I've been a journalist for more years than I care to remember, but that's the serious problem that I see with all of this is the quality of journalism. I was allowed, working on the Sunday Telegraph in Sydney back in the early 70s, for example, 3 or 4 weeks to investigate a story that may or may not stand up. You don't have that luxury now. And the problem I have... thank you. Does this work? No, it's not going to work. It's got a little red light on. It's now got a green light. I'll start again, I'm sorry. I worked at the Sunday Telegraph, for example, and among other organisations in Sydney, and we were allowed extensive time to investigate potential stories. As I understand it now, the demand of web-based things have got a constant deadline, not a 24-hour deadline, or Sunday Telegraph was a weekly deadline. You've now got a constant deadline, and there isn't time given to those investigative processes to which I believe which I believe are absolutely essential to good journalism.
I couldn't agree with you more. Yes, there is the pressure of immediacy in an online world. We were discussing earlier that immediacy is now, to be first, is now being first by 3 minutes. It's not being first by 24 hours like it once was, or like you remember. So I think actually the trend is reversing. I think what's happening now is that people are realising that you don't win too many people over by being first. You do win people over by being accurate. And I think that's where our mantra lies in the office that I run. Now, to answer your question more directly, Baker and McKenzie have just won an award or been nominated for a Walkley for an investigation that took them 3 weeks. I have a reporter now who's working on something which has currently taken her about 3 weeks. It still may not get up. It's about...
That took 3 months off on the
Was it worth it?
Yes.
Good on you. But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, there is that need to service people with immediate breaking news, but there also is a need, and I think this will create our point of difference. And our point of difference is certainly in enterprise journalism. Our point of difference is in creating something that nobody else has got. Our point of difference is about giving information that people require and that people need. So I mean, the short answer to your question is I couldn't agree more.
Jump in on that?
Sure.
Just a thought about the sorts of user behaviour that we're seeing. I think there's an increased trend towards grazing, where people will consume content in a much less directed fashion. So it used to be that people would open their preferred newspaper or magazine. These days people use things like Twitter as a web curation tool, and that's becoming pretty common. And that can be valuable because it means you get exposed to a wide variety of sources, but it also means that people are, more often than not, staying at a fairly shallow level in terms of their consumption of content. And that's concerning because it means that, you know, as a population, do we end up knowing a little bit about a lot of things. It's sad to see, but I think there are some opportunities for depth. I mean, I look at TechCrunch as a good technology industry example, where it started out as a blog. It's now got 12 million unique visitors and 37 million unique page views per month, I think, something like that. They've achieved that because they've been very narrowly focused on their demographic and on the content that they've produced. And I think that's one of the trends that we're seeing, that people achieve that sort of user stickiness by being very, very narrowly focused rather than broad.
Sarah, how do you go with that? Are your users focused heavily on certain areas, or what are the most popular
we're pretty, we focus on subculture basically. So we're concentrating on a small group of people, a niche group of people, and our advertisers recognise that as well, so we get smaller, niche advertisers. Sorry, what was the question again?
Well, what's your most popular content, and do people focus mainly on that, or do they have a spread?
So we tweet and Facebook a lot. We use the social media platforms a lot, and then they get directed back to our website, where we have short articles. We don't have long investigative kind of pieces. We're just there to tell people about things in our own language, and we get creative writers on board, like writing students that aren't necessarily journalists at all. Like we have journalism students coming in sometimes, but I think we're not journalists. We employ people who love what they do, and therefore they can express that through their writing and through whatever they're writing about. So I started as a look editor because I studied art, and if our readership can recognise that we actually know about what we're talking about, for example, with Brisbane Times, I know that your journalists are very informed.
I like to think so.
I think readers will come back to you because they know that you love what you do, and they know that you're informed about what you do.
How is the industry coming, the broadly speaking, journalism, online industry coming together? Do we have journalists now who can code, or do we have coders who can write? Is there still a marked difference as far as you're concerned, Simon?
We have, in our office, yes, I think, to your point, yes, the journalists are becoming more versatile in what they can do. We don't have journalists who can code because we have programmers who create templates for that. But journalists are starting to take photographs. Journalists are starting to take video. They're starting to edit their own video. We do have specialists in the office who can manage the process. So we have a videographer. We have, well, I guess, for example, and this is much to our dismay at the moment, but and it may change, but we don't have a full-time photographer. So journalists are essentially taking photographs for their own stories. We do have casuals who come in from time to time, but yeah, the versatility is on the rise.
Colin, if you were evaluating a proposal for a news startup, what sort of issues would you be looking at? Would it be viable, do you think? I mean, leaving aside Brisbane Times, which obviously is, most of them are going to face very challenging times.
So I'd be looking, like with any other startup company, for differentiation. How can that company show that it's going to do something that won't have it competing head-to-head with 1,000 other similar businesses? So for example, can they do something clever with video? So, in a lot of respects, YouTube is a good place to look for clever business models in the use of different types of content. They've been able to monetize that very effectively because they've realized that, for not so much for news, but for other types of content, people are looking to diversity. I'm not sure if I was an investor in startups that I would back too many startup companies that were looking to report on mainstream news. I'd look for maybe sector specialization. TechCrunch, I mentioned before, is a technology industry specific blog. If in a small number of years they can generate 37 million page views a month, that would be compelling.
Right. Here's an old-fashioned question via Twitter. It's one that's been bedeviling journalists for the last 100 years. In any advertising-based model, eyeballs equal dollars. How does a story's advertising potential affect its placement in the new world?
Start with that, yeah. Look, I think advertising is something of an arms race online. It used to be that a simple banner ad at the top of a web page would attract attention and there'd be a pretty high click-through rate. These days, people are desensitized. They see banner ads peripherally and they become very adept at ignoring them, and their brain filters out the content pretty well. The click-through rate on banner ads is extraordinarily low, and that's resulted in people having to develop and implement more intrusive forms of advertising, which, if they're over the top, people will stop visiting the site. And so that's a real challenge for advertisers, to be able to get content that's relevant to the user and engages with the user, but without them being pushed away from that site because it's too annoying. And the way that that's starting to get tackled is by having highly targeted content or highly targeted advertising. And Facebook, of course, has done this extremely well. And there's also now a number of companies that are popping up that are very accurately geotagging content, because a lot of it is consumed on mobile devices, and therefore, they know where you are. And there's almost a point now, I think, where really good advertising that is targeted and relevant to the consumer and geographically relevant is becoming indistinguishable from the content that you go to that site to consume. And that's, I think, a good thing. If the advertising is just content and it's as relevant as the news article or other material that you're reading, then that's probably a good outcome.
Sarah, how about you?
Well, we have a very niche, because we only have a smaller readership than you guys, but we know what our readership likes, and we know we can target our readership with the certain companies that advertise with us. And I think a big thing now is collaboration with actual advertisers. For example, we just did something with Connoisseur Ice Cream, where we have a section called Celebrity Non-Chef, and so we got celebrities to give us their recipes for Connoisseur, using Connoisseur Ice Cream. And I think this collaboration thing between bigger companies and smaller companies is something that's starting to happen around the world. Even just collaboration between, it doesn't necessarily have to be advertising, it can be anything. Between bigger companies just between bigger companies and smaller startups.
In terms of news placement on our side, the short answer is it doesn't. We maintain the same integrity that we always would with a newspaper, and that is the ads. If the ads are on the page, that's fine, but it's not going to affect our decisions with news. So I think what we are seeing are changes in where those ads are placed. That's the difference that we're seeing. And that's, I think, what Colin was referring to there before, in terms of advertisers, agencies, people flogging a product, being creative about what they do. So what we do is we create the environment, They then place their message, and if their message is creative, it will hit the niche market or the target market that we're looking at. So in a business environment, if people are looking to attract readers who are reading our business pages, if they can be creative and hit a nerve with those readers, then they'll get a click on their ad.
I think the only ad I've ever clicked on Brisbane Times is that Campbell's Web advertisement. That was a good one.
There's a question here on Twitter that says, is advertising the only way to make a buck online? And I can answer that for anybody else does, because I work for Thomson Reuters. Its newsletter division. It does not take any advertising at all, online newsletters. So that's one niche that succeeds without advertising. But how about broadly speaking? Simon, is there a way of making money online without advertising, without direct news, for example, without advertising?
I suppose what you're leading to is the burning paywall question. Is that where you're headed?
Well, that's where you're headed. So.
It's the question that everybody's asking, and it's certainly something that we're not looking at doing immediately. So we are looking at doing it in Sydney and Melbourne where the traffic warrants it. But we're not in Brisbane. We're not looking at a subscriber-based model, which is what we prefer to call it.
Right.
Because Sydney and Melbourne have a paper edition as well, so
they can look at bundling options, whereas we're quite happy to serve our readers the way that we are at the moment.
I'll throw in a couple of figures from the US. I've been, as part of my work with Brisbane Marketing and Brisbane City Council, looking at fostering a more active technology startup scene in Brisbane, and one of the places that everyone, of course, looks is Silicon Valley. And it's interesting to compare Brisbane and Silicon Valley because they're actually about the same size geographically, about the same demographic, and about the same population, about 2.5 million people. I think Brisbane's 2.1 million. Interestingly, the top 150 companies that are headquartered in Silicon Valley have a combined value of $1.85 trillion, which is more than the entire ASX, which is 2,200 and something companies. Now, obviously, they're in a bigger market. They're in America. But the point from that, in terms of the question about advertising revenues, is that almost none of those companies are fundamentally based on generating their own content and selling advertising. That they're generating advertising revenues. So Facebook obviously is a classic example, generating advertising revenues based on user-generated content only. Of course, with a lot of that, referring people to things that are non-user generated. But a very large proportion of that $2 trillion in value, thereabouts, is from companies that are not about content at all. And so I guess there are probably orders of magnitude more companies creating value from online activities, but where it's not about advertising. And so those are the opportunities I think we need to look for.
Well, you mentioned Facebook. It floated at supposedly $38, then it went to $32 from memory. Then it dropped.
If I was Mark Zuckerberg and I was lamenting the fact that my share of Facebook was only worth $15 billion, I think I'd console myself.
I think you could console us too.
Yeah.
But it might not be quite so good for those who bought in at $32. It went down to, I think, down to 19, and it went up recently to $26. A bit of a boost. I'm not quite sure why. But what does that do for confidence in startups? The fact that that.
I think for all but the last round of investors who went in with arbitrage in mind, I think Facebook's been a whopping success. I read recently that between the Facebook and Google initial public offerings, when they listed on NASDAQ, between the two of them, they created 2,000 millionaires. So, that's wealth creation and economic impact on a scale that we really ought to aspire to.
Well, you mentioned Amazon. Amazon started off by staking out the real estate and pouring all the funds back in. This is before the dot-com bubble burst because everybody else imitated it wrongly.
Yeah.
But who else is doing that at the moment? Do you have any ideas of who's staking out the ground?
Oh, lots of companies. Even a handful of Brisbane companies. We had an event last night at River City Labs called River Pitch, which was a startup investor pitching night, and over a nice dinner at the Polo Club, we had 4 startups pitching to a room full of 30 or so investors, and each of those 4 companies has the potential to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. All of them are worth approximately nothing today because, you know, they're startups. They're at the very beginning of their journey, but they're all doing things that are based on what people call disruptive innovation. So innovation where they are not the first in Brisbane to do it, they're not the first in Australia to do it, but they're the first in the world to do something. And those are the opportunities where if particularly using the internet, which is inherently extremely scalable, if you are the first and if there is user demand for what you're providing, that scalability allows you to tap into, as Instagram did, you know, tens or hundreds of millions of users in a very short period of time.
So they're startups who are not really much to do with news, but in terms of news organisations, how is the structure of the organisations affecting innovation these days? In traditional sense, journalists didn't care about what typewriters they were using or what printing was being done. Now I think they have to care because they're involved in the forefront of a technology.
Sure.
How's it affecting the newsroom, Simon? Is it impinging at all?
Sorry, I'm trying to pinpoint your question.
Well, journalists have to be involved in innovation. They're learning more. They're doing,
Correct.
you know, everything else to do with online.
Yes.
How is it affecting the structure and the innovation of your organisation or any organisation?
I don't see it as a negative at all. I think it's an exciting environment in the sense that all our journalists are encouraged to innovate. They're encouraged to look at new ways of presenting their news. They're encouraged to look at ways of engaging more people at a given time. They're encouraged to. We even spread the message to a degree that we fail fast, we fail early, we fail often. But if we do that, then a few of those ideas are going to stick, and that's where our office mantra is at the moment, and it's an exciting place to be.
Okay. Sarah, you're not on the cusp in terms of breaking news all the time, but you are updating constantly. How often does your site get updated and under what circumstances?
We update our site every day, but we use Twitter and Facebook a lot, and Instagram. We don't use Instagram so much, but I think Facebook and Twitter are really important to what we do and getting the word out and engaging with users and readers. A lot of our fans actually don't have Twitter, but then we reach wider audiences. I don't know, I don't think this is really effective in terms of business, but like a worldwide audience. We get people from all around the world through Twitter looking at our site, which isn't really effective for advertising or local things that are happening locally, but maybe it's good for people overseas to see what's happening in Brisbane as well.
Sorry, Sarah.
Okay. So.
One of the examples of innovation is quite clearly live blogging. So you'll see a news event covered live in an online environment, so that incorporates the pictures as they come through, it incorporates the video as it comes through, it incorporates snapshots of what's happening at any given time. A perfect example of that was the hurricane yesterday. I know that nationwide, Fairfax generated more than 2 million views on that live blog. That's one article. So within a 12-hour period, people were constantly looking at that article and constantly coming back to that article for updates. That's part of being innovative in your approach to news.
Have any of the three of you had any experience or thoughts about micropayments as a way of making money on the web? They were pushed very heavily years ago and never seemed to sink out of sight, but the technology now appears to be there, possibly, to actually make use of it.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Terry, years ago.
But the technology is now there to do it in a way that it wasn't years ago.
There will be models which come in, and I think it won't be seen as unreasonable for people to pay for news in the future. I think that will happen, and it will happen successfully. It's a matter of how news organisations and people in much higher positions and much smarter than me will make those decisions about how that business model is put into practice. So yeah, there will be micropayments of a sort, but I don't think it will be micropayments as was discussed years ago, and that is that people will buy a wallet and then they'll buy for stories as they use them. I think it will be a subscriber model.
Right. Google is trying that, and it's something of an experiment, but when Google does an experiment, they throw X $100 million of resource behind the experiment. So it's yet to be seen whether it's useful. I don't think they're trying to use micropayments to generate revenues from mainstream media-generated content, but I think what they've recognised is that there's a lot of user-generated content that's actually pretty good, pretty valuable. So not the the random stuff that appears on someone's Facebook page, but actually people who have a depth of knowledge about a particular topic and maybe maintain a really high-quality blog and have some number of thousands of visitors. And that'll be an interesting experiment to watch, because that will then, to some extent, decentralise the revenue-generating possibilities from major media organisations to small, even one-person outfits that are generating very tailored content and to a very niche audience.
Well, one of the first of those, I think, was excuse me, Andrew Sullivan in the US, who years ago started his own blog. It's now a huge success. Yeah. He's actually sold it recently, I think. But he made his money from that through advertising on his site. There was no micropayment involved, but he was a small one-man band making a very good living in competition with the large networks. Will we see a lot more of that happening, do you think?
I actually think we're going to start seeing technology used in some different ways. So I'm a bit of a tech buff, and one of the technical trends that I think we're going to start to see is a thing called NFC, or near field communications. So a growing number of smartphones actually have NFC built in, and NFC is simply a technology that allows you to put your phone next to a device or a reader and instantly absorb content. Yeah. And you're starting to see this. There's a company in Australia called Tappet, and there's a number of companies doing this, where you'll see billboards with an NFC sign on it. So it used to be you'd see a QR code, so those kind of barcode, two-dimensional things, and people don't use them generally because it's a pain. You've got to open up your barcode reader and scan it, and it takes you to some website. But I think we'll start to see a major trend towards ad hoc content acquisition, where you'll be walking down the street, you'll see something that's NFC enabled, or you'll be in a shop or a library, and there'll be something that's NFC enabled, and you just put your phone on it and you will have acquired the content. And I think that will allow people to experiment with different ways of content delivery.
That's not, I hope, going to end up whereby you're going to get that content without any choice on your part.
No, obviously very serious privacy issues that have to be addressed along the way.
So who's going to make a quid very soon? You can't obviously talk about the individual you met last night at this pitch, but can you tell us a little bit about any of the pitches?
Yeah, look, I think I'll make some general comments. So the first thing I mentioned before is to be unique on the planet, not to be the first in Brisbane or in Australia to try a new different type of business model. The other general observation would be that people talk about technology and internet startups, and they think that you have to have a room full of people with pointy heads who can write code that looks like the Matrix. These days, I mean, there are 14-year-old kids who have apps on the Apple App Store that are making money. And so the learning curve is really, really condensed. So one of the companies that pitched at this event last night was actually founded by two foreign exchange traders who quit their day jobs and said, we're going to do a startup that relies on their experience in foreign exchange trading, and that's part of their whole value proposition. But these guys picked up the textbooks and learned how to code within a couple of months, and so they did the first iteration of their website, which has e-commerce transactional capabilities and a lot of bells and whistles, without having to spend $1 on any pointy-headed people.
Good question there. Hang on, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you. How's that? Is that okay? Good. Terry, and the panel, I've been extremely fortunate. I've had probably a bit over 40, like my good colleague here, who probably had 40 years in journalism, which is, I've had the odd time driving cabs, but between jobs. But one issue that when I studied in journalism and as I've worked in journalism, is what we call the Code of Ethics, which when I've been a member of the AJA all my life, the previous Australian Journalists Association, now the MEAA, and when I went through even though I did journalism at the University of Queensland, I was the editor of Semper Flora, the paper out there, but I still went into a cadetship, and I had to do my gradings through Rural Press in Brisbane. But the Code of Ethics was something that, as young journalists, it was more than instilled. Now, I'm going to sound like a dinosaur now, and my grandchildren tell me this all the time, but I find I'm now working on electronic newsletters, and similar to the Brisbane Times, but young journalists coming through now, if I mention the word ethics or I mention the word, truth, basic human values, just doesn't seem to quite gel. But all I've heard here tonight is, and I'm sorry to be a little bit destructive here, is making money. And Terry led the charge there a couple of times, and Simon's in the black, and I'm glad he's in the black. But those values, I just, and our other two panellists there who work on the internet, I watch Media Watch every Monday night religiously, and I just find time and time again there is just such basic dishonesty that's going on out there, all for the sake of entertainment and all for the sake of making money.
I'm happy to jump in.
Please do.
I'm not sure if you were here for the opening, but I did say at the opening that the Brisbane Times had built itself on a platform of integrity, credibility, and accuracy. Now,
but Facebook can do that.
Facebook can do that. Well, no, but we have trained journalists who've been through the system. Not everybody's a 17-year-old cadet. We have journalists who have been through exactly what you've been through as our seniors, guiding the younger journalists through the system. So just because we're in a digital environment doesn't mean that we lose our integrity. Quite the contrary.
But Simon, sooner or later that cycle's going to come to the stage where...
Not if we don't allow it to.
Can I jump in there? I work for a digital newsletter, and this week, on Monday, there was a spirited discussion in the office between four of us, two of whom were about 19, about ethics. And please don't try and tell me that young people don't care about ethics. Sorry, I find that rubbish. How about you?
There's a danger when you're relying too much on Twitter, Facebook sort of technology, that ethics has got no part in it at all. Defamation laws have got no role.
Tony, you might as well say that relying on the telephone system and Telstra would damage your ethics. They're the same as Telstra. They are communication channels. They are tools for people. They are not actual news.
What you're saying is basically the race for immediacy probably dilutes the integrity, and I beg to differ. I think that the race for immediacy, as I said earlier, the trend is actually reversing in that we rely on our accuracy to gain our audience. If we are regarded as a cowboy of the industry, which we're not, we will lose our audience, and therefore we'll lose our advertisers, therefore we won't be in the black anymore. So our platform has got to be integrity.
Terry, could I ask the other two panellists whether...
Yeah. I would agree with you in as much as there is a very strong emphasis on making money, and certainly there are individuals that we would encounter, and I don't think this is different to any time in recent history, but there are certainly examples of people who have done things to make a large amount of money that ethically are either highly questionable or they should be shot for. Having said that, I think the online community does add a need for a layer of transparency. And you've seen, well, I'll give you a recent example, an American company called Airbnb. So Airbnb, short for Air, Bed and Breakfast, and it's a company that was born out of the notion that if you had a spare room in your house, or you're going to be away for a month, you could rent out your house to another person who wanted to not stay in a hotel, for example, and you'd make some money. So it's monetizing excess capacity is one way to put it. That company grew very rapidly, sold 50 million nights of accommodation without too many hiccups, and then they had a major disaster where a lady's apartment was trashed by someone who had used Airbnb to book that as a means of accommodation. They smashed the place up. They stole all of her stuff. It was a fiasco. The CEO of Airbnb in this instance decided that what he would do is get his media team onto it and his PR team, and they put out a press release that says, look, in our terms and conditions, it says that we're not liable, and whilst we feel really sorry for the individual, it's too bad. And it was a major learning experience, because they had thousands and thousands of their customers get on social media and say that's not good enough. They had their investors, they had a number of investors actually bail out of the company, so the online community held them to account, to the point that they actually had to issue a major retraction and put in place a bunch of new mechanisms around insurance and referee checking and that sort of thing.
With respect, that's got nothing to do with journalism. That's the corporate matter.
Correct, and since I'm not a journalist,
what we're talking about is ethics in journalism, not ethics in corporations. We don't believe they exist.
Okay.
I don't believe ethics
I'll leave that one.
In publishing corporations they existed either. Amongst journalists, yes, but not amongst them. But this session is about making a buck online, so I don't think you can really complain too much about that. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, please.
A lot of the discussion so far has... Thanks. A lot of the discussion so far has focused on income generation within pre-existing newsrooms or environments or sites. I guess I'm interested in where the income generation opportunities are for people who are freelance or who are independent content producers who are interested in the content production side of things, but not necessarily already within an existing or a traditional newsroom structure or within an organisation or have a blog. Where do those people find their niche in the existing newsroom? Do you buy exclusive content from these people? Is it a matter of them having their own websites and trying to, or blogs and trying to get income generated out of those? Where are the sort of the income generation ideas for them?
Yeah, it's a tough question, and it's a tough market. The freelance market has always been tough. I think the best advice I can offer is in niche marketing, is if you can formulate, as Sarah does, a niche market for whatever it is that you write. Globally, there are a number of very successful bloggers who make a lot of money. We have, on our site, we have a collaboration with a number of bloggers, and we call it the Blog Army. If you go to the Brisbane Times, you'll see those. We pay them for their content. It's a nominal fee. It's not going to make them millions of dollars, but they use that as leverage to promote their own sites, which they then attract advertising and do it that way. So that is, there are alternatives as far as I can see. May have some other suggestions.
Well, I mentioned Andrew Sullivan earlier. He was one of the earlier ones, but there are little umbrella sites springing up all over the world. We have traditionally had the big umbrella sites like Fairfax, News Limited, Financial Times, and so on, with hundreds or sometimes thousands of journalists and printers and editors and production people. Now there are sites popping up where you find 2 or 3 or 4 people. Usually most of them are at least nominally journalists, but they share the load. One might do the coding, the website, one might do the writing, one might do the editing, one might do the selling of the advertising. And these are small shops popping up everywhere. Wearing my union hat for a moment, the MEAA is interested in in enhancing ethics within these groups, because many of the people have never worked in traditional media organizations, and they haven't been exposed to the media ethics that imbue those organizations. So we're interested in moving in helping people, and I know it's a union hat, but we're helping employers to run their companies properly and ethically and profitably. And there are many, many more of them. They're popping up everywhere. Unfortunately, not every journo has the business skills or the desire to go out from underneath that big umbrella and put up a tiny little parasol and get wet while they start to earn a living. But it's happening more and more. Are you seeing more of that?
Well, look, I'm starting to see a strong trend towards crowdsourcing of a whole lot of capabilities. So there aren't too many people these days that would pay someone in Australia $100 an hour for something that they could outsource to someone in a low cost of labour part of the world for $10 an hour. You know, an example, I created a website recently, and I paid a very friendly, very capable website developer in Pakistan the princely sum of $8 an hour to do something that I would have taken a long time to figure out, and it would have cost me a lot of money to have someone in Australia do it. So you know, and I think the same can apply to content generation in some limited respects. I think, you know, having someone on the ground is always going to be valuable for a lot of types of content. But certainly outsourcing that is becoming more common, and I think it's a trend that if we don't get on the front of that wave, we'll be on the back of the wave and suffer.
We're almost out of time, but Sarah, have you anything you'd like to add to that?
I can't even remember what I was going to say.
Well,
but I think crowdfunding is getting a bit over the top as well, because you don't want to fund every single project that you see in your Facebook, and I don't know if there's any other alternatives. And people will fund if you have a good project, they will fund it via crowdfunding places like Possible or Kickstarter or whatever. But it's also over the top because you get like 10 new projects a day or something like that. But in terms of freelancing, I think it's just important to know what you want and work hard at getting it. That's all I've got to say.
Can't argue with that. Simon, do you want to wrap up on your point of view? Anything about freelancing or outsourcing, crowdsourcing?
Not so much on freelancing and outsourcing, but I think in terms of tonight's discussion, it's been fruitful to the point that, you know, I appreciate the concerns on ethics. I certainly appreciate that there are multiple ways of making money in an online environment or in a digital environment, and that will change. I think what we'll see in the future is probably less marked on advertising. There will probably revenue share arrangements will come into play. You may see news sites with back-end shopping malls. You may see news sites creating a fully paid model. You may see a micro-payment type model. There are a number of avenues, but everybody's testing the water right now, and if we all had the answer, then we'd all be on that yacht.
Quite right. We don't have the answer, but hopefully we pointed some people some of the way towards finding the answer. I think it's been a fruitful discussion, and I hope you'll join me, please, in thanking our three panellists.
I'll just give them all a very small gift by way of token of appreciation. So thank you again. Please join me in thanking them once more.
Oh, thank you. Physical book.
That feels like a
Okay.
That's good, Tim.
Good.